that you get to take it. Next up, we're going to be talking about an issue that I feel like just does not get enough airtime. And I was at a conference in Denver, and one of the things that happened in that room was that I asked everybody, basically at random, 10 people were given a Post-it note, and they were the people who had analog. They weren't allowed to move, and everyone else was essentially digital and could move around, and they had different questions to answer. And I didn't give any other instruction to the people who were stuck in their place. All I said was that they were analog. I said, find a place that you feel safe and stay there. When I asked everybody else to move around and essentially asked them to network and do different things that they felt like were advantageous to them by the end of that exercise, one thing that was really important was the people who couldn't move. That was something that I didn't expect for one of the little girls in the audience to say that somebody understands how I feel because she had cerebral palsy. And to her, she's essentially one of those 10% of the people who doesn't have access. And it was not the point of that exercise to talk about the 10% that was excluded. I think the point was to make sure that people understood what it felt like to essentially be limited in being able to share your message. But what a takeaway was for me was that we aren't talking enough about ways to actually expand our reach to communities that have limited access. So it was really important to bring in James Thurston, who's going to be coming up here. He is a thought leader in his field, both here in the United States and abroad. He's worked on a variety of tech and public policy issues that relate directly to social impact and economic issues. And today he's going to share a little bit about how his passion project about expanding access to people with disabilities essentially turned into an organization. James?
Good morning, and thank you very much. Thank you, Francella, for inviting me to what is already a great discussion, and to really speak about, as you said, I think a passion for my organization and for me personally, which is the inclusion, the digital inclusion of people with disabilities around the world, and obviously across this country as well. Just by way of introduction, my organization is G3ICT, the Global Initiative for Inclusive ICTs. We were set up about 13 years ago with support of the United Nations, specifically to help countries around the world improve the inclusion, the digital inclusion of people with disabilities around the world. And Francella, you had mentioned to me earlier the exercise, which I think is really illustrative of the fact that we all live on some sort of a spectrum of ability and disability. There are about 1 billion people in the world today with a disability. That's about 15% of the population. Most likely, at least 15% of the people in your city, in your company, are people with disabilities. And importantly, 70% of disabilities are not necessarily something that you're going to be able to see or notice. So it's interesting, I was doing some work with a large, very large multilateral agency on these issues of technology and accessibility and inclusion, and a senior executive said to me, well, we don't really need to think about accessibility of our technology and connectivity of people with disabilities because they don't come to our conferences. Which my response to that was, well, maybe they would come to your conferences if you were accessible, A. And B, you don't really know that they don't come to your conferences because you're not going to necessarily know if someone has a cognitive disability just by looking at them. So there's a lot of work in the public sector, I think, in particular, that needs to be done around awareness, and our organization, G3ICT, was created to sort of help with that around the world, which we've been doing for many years now. About 4 years ago, we launched a specific initiative called Smart Cities for All, because what we were seeing were some trends and some realities, frankly, that when taken on their own were not necessarily concerning, but when taken together, were concerning to us, particularly around the use of technology by cities, in cities, and what was the impact on people with disabilities. So we launched this initiative called Smart Cities for All. And some of the trends that we were seeing, which some of these may be familiar to you, some of them may not be as familiar, we are increasingly in urban worlds. Today, about half of the global population lives in a city. That's going to increase to 70% by the year 2050. In China alone, to keep up with the in-migration of people into cities, they would actually have to build a new city every week of 1 million people. That's how many people are moving into urban centers. 10 of the fastest growing cities on the planet are in Africa. So we really are an urban society, which I live here in Washington, D.C. I like living in a city. But as cities are deploying technology, there are some real things to think about whether or not the connectivity is there and the accessibility of that technology and those smart solutions are there for people with disabilities. We also know that there's this enormous digital transformation happening. It's happening in cities as well. I think one of the most important things that we see around the world and here in the US is that we have today a generation of digital natives. They've grown up, they've gone to university perhaps, but they've been using technology from, I won't say from birth, but from a very young age. And their expectation is that they will be using technology, which again has, for people with disabilities, huge implications if they are not part of that digital native generation. And I'll talk in a minute just about why. One of the areas in urban environments that we see this digital transformation happening is in transportation and mobility. Some projections are saying that there'll be almost 110 billion miles of usage of mobility as a service in the next few years. I was doing some work with a mobility as a service company, Move It, which some of you may use their app to plan your transportation around your city. About 6 months ago, we were doing some work together, and they mentioned that today, or back then 6 months ago, it's probably even more, they had 500 million users around the world that were using their solution, their smart solution to plan the transportation, and they were supporting 5 billion trips a day. So clearly you can see how technology is permeating how we're living our lives in cities around the world. Smart cities are really on the leading edge of this digital transformation and really helping to redefine how we as human beings interact with each other, interact with our governments. You can see cities using technology across all of the services they provide. I certainly see that here in Washington, where probably some of you live as well, most of you. I know I get an SMS message unfortunately, several times a day about crime that's happening in my neighborhood. Which is important to me to know. But there's all kinds of ways cities are using it for citizen engagement, digital 311 systems to report potholes and broken streetlights. I was actually talking to the Disability Commissioner for the city of Chicago recently, and increasingly their services are going completely online, so housing support. She was actually telling me about a person with a disability that came into her office who had been evicted, and again, this is a person of disability in the winter in Chicago, been evicted, and really the only way to get remediation for that, to appeal it, was online. But this person didn't have that available to them. So there's really critical services that cities are offering that, again, if people with disabilities don't have the connectivity and don't have access to accessible devices, then they're not going to work for everyone. I mentioned that there's about 1 billion people in the world, 15% of the population, 70% of disabilities are not visible to the eye just by looking at someone. And I think importantly, beyond those statistics are the outcomes. People with disabilities are the least likely to start school, the least likely to finish school, the most likely to be unemployed, and this is in any market in any country in the world. The most likely to live in poverty, the most likely to be underbanked and not part of the financial services sector, which contributes to poverty. So there are enormous drivers for really thinking about people with disabilities as part of our cities and whether or not they are connected as part of this digital transformation. Interestingly, people with disabilities and their immediate family are also a market, and this is a point that I use with the companies that we work with, they're a market of about $8 trillion a year of disposable income. And so accessibility of technology does matter, and it can be a good business decision, and you're seeing companies, like many of the sponsors actually of the event today, that are technology companies, that are thinking about accessibility as a good business driver. Accessibility, and when I talk about accessibility, I'm talking about technology that actually works for everyone. You can design any piece of technology to work for someone with any kind of disability. There's actually very good standards that allow you to do that. But cities aren't necessarily thinking about that as they're deploying technologies and smart solutions to support their services. So for example, in the mobility space, I talked about transportation planning and using apps to find out when the next bus or subways coming and how you make those connections. Great, I love using those. But for someone with a visual disability, that's a lot of very rich graphical information, maps, schedules. Someone using a screen reader may not be able to use that if it's not made to be accessible, that solution. Likewise, in the digital payment space, kiosks for ticketing and in train stations and airports, even payments. A lot of cities use those to make payments of different bills. Those can be designed for someone to be used, even with touchscreens, used by someone who has a visual disability, someone who's in a wheelchair. They can be designed so that a wheelchair can get up to them, and that the screen and the keyboard are positioned in a way that someone in a wheelchair can actually use them and see them. Citizen engagement. A lot of cities are going to digital 311 systems to do this kind of reporting and to push information out to citizens or people and get information from them. I was working with one of the largest cities in Mexico. Recently, they were incredibly proud, in a leading smart city, frankly, in the world. They were incredibly proud of their new digital 311 system that they had developed themselves. And when I asked about accessibility, you could see the CIO's face just sort of drain of all color, because they realized that most people with disabilities would not be able to use that solution, which is a huge problem. So we know today, when we started the Smart Cities for All initiative at G3ICT, we actually did a global study of experts around the world, more than 250 experts in smart cities and who knew about smart cities. And what we found, unfortunately, is that in reality today, smart cities are actually making the digital divide worse, not better. 60% of these experts believe that smart cities are failing people with disabilities. Just 18% of them knew of a smart city that was actually using, across their technology deployments, using these robust ICT accessibility standards. And about a year ago, we did a separate study on innovation and urban innovation ecosystems, and how are incubators and accelerators that are coming up with these great new smart solutions, how are they thinking about inclusion and accessibility? And they're not, unfortunately. So in that way, these urban innovation ecosystems are really kind of setting us further back. I love the solutions coming out of them. I come from the technology industry myself, but they're typically not accessible to people with disabilities. And I should say that as we all age, we pick up some age-related impairment that affects how we use technology. So the benefits of accessible technology and smart solutions really do go to all of us. All of that data is available on our website. I will point you to some solutions. We've actually created a toolkit that we're using with cities around the world. It's available in 10 languages. And it includes some things like an assessment tool to find out how good is a city at using data in deploying technology when it comes to inclusion of people with disabilities. We've got some model procurement language that cities can put into their tenders and RFPs to make sure that when they're buying technology to deploy, that it's only accessible technology. And so there's a set of tools that we make available. I encourage you to check those out. We really can design smart cities that are inclusive of everyone, including people with disabilities. A big part of the challenge is awareness. So I appreciate, Francella, the opportunity to speak with some of these thought leaders today about this issue, and make sure that as we're thinking broadly about connectivity and digital inclusion, that we're also thinking about people with disabilities. The chair of our board is the ambassador of Ecuador to the United Nations. He's sort of considered the father of a human rights treaty for people with disabilities. He often says that disability is the one group that if you live long enough, we're all going to age into that group one day or another, or get into it some other way, through an accident. If you're not born with a disability, at some point you will likely end up having a disability, even a situational disability. So if for no other reason than a very selfish reason, we should all be caring about, are we making our cities accessible? Thank you very much.